Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and for having me and the fabulous panel that we've got. We've got a 20-minute session, and here they come. I'm going to introduce them briefly with short, hopefully interesting anecdotes so that they can spend the bulk of the time telling stories about data and investigative journalism. The first panelist who will speak is a man that those of you sitting here since this afternoon at least are familiar with, Simon Rogers. Simon is the author of the Guardian's data blog. He is the data journalist's data journalist. Data journalists love to follow Simon on Twitter, to read his writings. He's great. He's been on Twitter for more than 3 years, and just this summer posted the most favorited tweet of all time for Simon, which was a detailed description of how the Guardian does its data journalism. So go and check that out. Next speaker after Simon is Francis Irving. Francis is the CEO of ScraperWiki, one of the most interesting projects going on online, a site where data journalists and others create website scraping technologies and share them with each other, keep them in good repair, etc. Francis is very good about eating dog food. He has 173 scrapers on the site. He is the second most prolific user of his own community after his technical director, Julian Todd. I know because I scraped the site. After that is Jeff Jarvis. Jeff is a blogger, a podcaster, and an author, most recently of a new book called Public Parts, How Sharing in the Digital Age Improves the Way We Work and Live. Jeff is a great blogger over at buzzmachine.com. And our final speaker will be Mike Nelson, who also spoke this afternoon. Mike is a research associate at the Leading Edge Forum and an advocate of radical transparency. Data futurists might be interested to know, as I was, that across all of Twitter, as far as I can tell, Mike Nelson is the only person who uses the word exaflood in his Twitter bio. Other than at exaflood, which has been the opposite of an exaflood, with 2 tweets over 2 years. So, with that introduction, we'll begin with Simon sharing his thoughts on his work, the state and future of data and investigative journalism.
Thank you, Marshall. I was going to stand up and walk around, but these sofas are really comfortable, so I'm going to stay here. But I thought I'd talk a bit more about the Riot project, which I mentioned a bit in the speech, because it's part of a bigger term data project for us, and it's probably going to be the biggest data journalism project the Guardian's ever been involved in. So just to recap, beginning of August, there were 4 days of pretty severe rioting across England, so UK, but really it was just England. Started in London, a bit of North London called Tottenham, which is, if anybody's ever been there, is a pretty poor place where a guy was shot by the police. And what started off as a kind of demonstration outside the police station, very badly mishandled, went out of control, and then it just spread. But what was interesting about it started as 2 days of riots about this very specific issue, and it became a kind of mass shopping expedition by rioters who were then kind of breaking into shopping malls all over the country, and interestingly, things that were trainer stores, a lot of trainer stores, and people even had time to sit down and try them on. So it was like it's just an amazing kind of story. But what we thought was, when there's something like this happens, you want to kind of look at why it happens, because otherwise how can you kind of prevent it happening again? And we were very kind of modelled initially this stuff on the big project after the '67 Detroit riots, where they interviewed actual people who were involved in the actual rioting and found out, in fact, rather than politicians pontificate about what the case was. So I introduced this before, but this is basically our map, which we ran off a Google Fusion table, set up in about 10 minutes, embedded on a page on the site, and it was the biggest page we did for 2 days in a row. People were trying to find out what was going on and where it was happening. And actually, there wasn't one place where you could do that, and increasingly that's what we find is the case. You just want one place to tell you what's going on, one place to look at, and that's not always the case. So behind that, we've got the Google Fusion table with the locations. Each of these dots represents, say, a shop that had been looted, or an event, or a particular incident. So we had a set of places with geodata, with geographic data. That's what happened if you zoom. The great thing about Fusion Tables obviously gives you that Google Map kind of functionality, and you can zoom right into street level, and you can see where stuff went on. And then what started to happen is that people were being arrested very, very quickly. The streets were being swamped with police. 2,500 people arrested, which is a lot. And there have already been 1,700 court cases. Now, what you think was, well, this would be a great thing where we could actually record all the cases that come up. Now, what used to happen with court cases in the UK, I don't know what it's like here, but you had little local reporters from local newspapers and agencies who would go to every single court case ever. They would just go to them and they would, hopefully get a story they could sell to the big boys. But that doesn't happen anymore because there are no local paper journalism going on. The news agencies only really worry about selling stuff they can definitely sell. So we're getting kind of partial recordings. So then we were bringing up the court's office, and the phone calls went something like this. You'd ring up and say, oh, hello, I want the court records office. And they'd put you through to somebody and say, right, I'm calling from the Guardian. We'd like a list of all your cases today that are riot-related and what happened, just the results. So what do you want that for? Well, we just want it as public information. Well, you'll have to go to the Ministry of Justice for that. So after 2 days of this, we went to the Ministry of Justice and forced them to send a note round to every court in the country saying they have to give us this information. So they all started flooding us with PDFs, basically. And am I getting a signal there? Okay. Try it now. There we go. This is what we got. This is a typical court register. UK. You don't often see these unless you're a reporter in court. What you've got is you've got names, addresses, date of birth, age, and you've got details of the offence and where the offence took place. So you've got where somebody lived, where the offence took place, and the details of the offence and what they were charged under and what happened to them. And how am I doing for time? Yeah, okay. So really, really quickly, what happened is this data is really, really badly formatted. You can't just copy it off. You can't properly scrape. I think even ScrapeWiki guys would have a problem with this stuff. So we've had teams of people who've been going through all of these documents. And the other thing is it doesn't say riot related on them. You have to notice that it's on the right date, that it's the right kind of offence. And we had an assumption that people were being treated more seriously for riot cases than were being treated for regular cases. And this helped us a lot because normally if you go to a magistrate's court, which is the basic level of court in England, you get bailed, you get sent home. Riot-related cases were not getting sent home. People stole packets of chewing gum worth £1 and they were being remanded to jail. And you think how much expensive it is to send people to jail. So we found 60% of cases were being remanded to jail. It was compared to about 3 or 4% of cases normally at that first stage of the courts. So that meant that very, very quickly we kind of accumulated a database of about 1,000 records. We did all this mapping, which I've shown you earlier, where we mapped it against poverty. And we got stories in the paper. This is the first time we've ever had the word Guardian data on a front-page story in The Guardian. I hope it's not the last. And we had stuff inside, spreads inside and so on. And it meant that we suddenly had this amazing database that criminologists would kill for. And so what we're doing now is we're working on a big project with the London School of Economics, funded by Joseph Rowntree Foundation and the Open Society Foundations. We've built up this data set now. We've got 1,500 records of people. And we're going to go and interview. We're going to write to all of those people and try and interview them and create an amazing kind of record of the riots. So something that starts off as raw data, and we're going to turn it into qualitative journalism about something that nobody really understands what happened and nobody really understands why. And part of it is this thing here, where basically Twitter, for the first time, released to us all the riot-related tweets. So this is just something we did very, very quickly, which shows Twitter traffic amongst the riots. The first line, the red line, is for the Tottenham, anything tagged with Tottenham. The orange line is Enfield, which is the second night the riots started happening. The blue line you can't see is Hackney, which is the third night, and that big black line is riot clean-up after it, which shows maybe the kind of people that are on Twitter. It was interesting because there was a lot of nonsense spoken about how Twitter had encouraged the riots, encouraged rioters to know where to go. So to actually be able to take that apart is a really big deal for us. So hopefully this is going to be a really enormous project, but it's something that starts off as a very, very quick piece of data work and expands into something that will take us months and months, but hopefully tell us something really interesting.
Great. That's wonderful, Simon. So Francis, your turn. Show us how it's done.
Okay, I'm going to tell you a simple story about some local data journalism in Scotland. And first of all, ScrapeWiki is a place where data scientists can put scripts that process data and get them to run in the cloud. This is one of our data journalism camps that we ran. And the guy on the left is Robert, who's a hacker who works for a startup in Scotland. And the guy on the right is Michael, who was a Guardian beat blogger at the time. And we run the camps because we think it's important. One of the first trends, I think, I'm going to say, is that investigative data journalism will involve multiple skills. You have to have people who are good with data, and you have to have people who are good at understanding what the story is as well. So they decided to investigate Edinburgh planning applications. So this is the site you go to on Edinburgh Council's website to find building permits. And as you can see, you have to know the name of the application already. There's a very kind of clunky interface for getting it. It's very hard to work out what's going on. So Robert, on ScraperWiki, wrote a normal Python script to scrape the data. And you can see it uses mechanized LXML if you're technical. So it's a standard kind of thing. And that produces a data set on ScraperWiki that then runs and gets maintained in the cloud and gives you an API and lets you download the CSV file. So the second trend, I think, is happening, is this involuntary release of data. So the Edinburgh Council had gave no permission for this to happen. And in the same way as WikiLeaks involuntarily releases data, if you can reprocess data that has been released deliberately but has got information buried in it that no one's noticed before, or link it to other data sets. And I think we'll see more of that happening, and scraping's an important part of that. So when Robert finished that, they made a map of it, and then Michael dug into it for stories. And one of the things he spotted from working with the data was where the application for a controversial new paintball site was. And then he went around and interviewed people in the area to see what they thought, and turned it into an investigation, into a story. So that's the kind of classic investigation. It's not enough just to leave it at that. The collaboration carries on, so the geek and the journalist have continued to work together since then and done more things. And one of the interesting things is turning it into a news application. So the third trend, I think, is going to happen is that the viewer will become more involved. So as there's kind of tends to generally be less money available now to pay investigative journalists, you can create stories automatically. So in this case, Robert made a scraper to push the data out into Twitter and made a Twitter account, which people can follow to get news about planning applications in Edinburgh. And this kind of slicing of data lets you automatically tell stories to people and let people find their own stories by exploring data. And it also creates this kind of flow of letting the readers find things and then feed them back to the journalists. So I think there'll be a trend of this feedback loop between the reader and the journalist. And so if you want anything scraping, then go to ScraperWiki and you can submit a data request and get our help or write the code yourself.
So as Marshall pointed out back in the back room, we go from the people who actually do something to the theorist who does nothing. And then, of course, that means I teach it. But I want to just hit a few points. I think the first one is that even as we see this wonderful flood of data, we ain't seen nothing yet in terms of our definition of what data are. And so the case I use for everything new about journalism these days is Andy Carvin at NPR. And I presume you all know Andy Carvin? Yeah. Anybody not? ACARVN. If you haven't, and he, as you know, tweeted and retweeted the Arab Spring. In his height was one day in Tahrir Square, 1,300 tweets and retweets. And what struck me about Andy that's so illustrative is that it is news starting to mimic the architecture of the net, end-to-end, witness to world. And Andy didn't say to anybody, hey, would you crowdsource your revolution? It was happening without him. But the journalist comes and adds value to that. And he adds value in tremendous ways. Vetting who's there, debunking rumors, confirming things, asking questions, giving context, and so on. And we at CUNY are going to do a data analysis, thanks to NPR and Twitter, of how Andy creates his nodes and networks. And I use that just as an illustration to say that there's data everywhere. There's content everywhere. If you're Google, you look at content everywhere. If we in the content business, we tend to think that content is that which we make because we are the content business. And it's not. And so there's an incredible amount of content out there. At the same time, of course, we're losing staff and we're shrinking. And some people might look at narrative science as a bad guy in there, but I see a very good guy in that it makes us more efficient. And it enables you, if I could take some of the things you just showed and put narrative science over it and see what narratives it gives us as a get-go into this, that it can write all the stupid sports stories so you can write the really world-shaking, important sports analysis, that you can do all these new things, and there's new data everywhere. And I think we've got to look at it that way and say that there's a story in everything. I talked to an executive and a former head of a network news operation here in the U.S. who complained that Google and Facebook use content companies' steel to make Google's cars. And he said Facebook doesn't honor or doesn't value our content. And I said it's actually the opposite. Facebook values more content than you do. You only value the content you make. Facebook values the things that everyone creates, and they see value in that. And of course, we've all heard the story now of Twitter and the hedge fund that's come out of analyzing the moods in Twitter and predicting the ups and downs in the Dow. There's content everywhere. Data turns into content. It turns into narratives. So the final thing that I have a struggle with in my job teaching journalism students, and I teach entrepreneurial journalism, so I primarily teach them to be greedy so they can eat and we can keep going as a business. But I don't know how to teach what these guys do. And I know that they'll both come generously to my school and teach. But I think that the more that there is still, and there's an incredible generosity to what you do and what you find, but there's also something frightening to people about it. They think they can't do it. They don't know it. They want to know how to do it, but it's a big leap to go. So I think that the more that we see tools that both visualize this and create the means to find the stories and find the narratives in it, the better off we are. Last point. About 4 or 5 years ago, the Fort Myers News Press, a Gannett paper in Florida, filed a Freedom of Information Act request for data about a hurricane relief, pre-Katrina, that went haywire. And they saw all this huge amount of data landed on their laptops, and they said, what do we do with it? We don't know what happened. Obviously, they asked the right question. They said, the people living in the town know what happened. They put it up as a search engine, put in your address, and in 48 hours, they got 66,000 searches. And they got the kinds of stories that you go for. The more we do that, the more we open it up, the more we create, and pardon me for the plug of the book, the tools of publicness that enable the public to see this data and do things with it themselves. So the data journalism isn't the journalists doing it, it's the public doing it. And the more we can get to that, I think the stronger a democracy we'll have.
So, Mike, if you could take a few minutes to take us home and wrap it up. If there's a pail of water that has to fall on someone's head when the timer, please drop it on my head, not on
Okay.
Mike's.
Well, I'm going to pick up where Jeff left off. Like Jeff, I teach about this topic. I haven't played with big data since I was doing my PhD in geophysics 25 years ago. But I've been in Washington for 25 years trying to help make these things possible, helping promote the growth of the Internet and some of these tools, helping get funding for research. So I'm going to talk about the politics and the policy around this space. I haven't written any investigative journalism pieces, but I have been on the receiving end of some investigative journalism pieces, both when I was in the Senate and at the White House. So I understand how the politicians look at this. It's with hope and great anxiety. I mentioned earlier that I learned about bumper stickers in Washington. I also learned that policy is driven by worst-case scenarios. Time and time again, we get really stupid laws, restrictions on our freedoms because of worst-case scenarios. And so I'm going to give you 2 scenarios. I teach a class at Georgetown called How to Predict the Futures, because we don't just focus on one future, we look at several different scenarios. In the interest of time, I'll give you 2 quick scenarios. One scenario is sort of an extension of what we're doing today. Great things are happening. People are writing this kind of stories that Simon and Francis and others have talked about. We're informing the public. We're helping people make better decisions. We're unmasking corruption in some cases, forcing government to be more responsive and more efficient. We're seeing a lot of that in the third world. That's a great scenario. I don't think we're doing a good enough job of explaining all the good that's coming out of this. And I think in order to get the politicians on our side now, while it's still early in the movement, we need to do a better job of explaining how important this is. But there is the unfortunate scenario, the worst-case scenario. And this could very easily happen. We're already starting to see some cases where people are getting a hold of big data and they're publishing maps that have a direct, immediate impact on individual citizens and homeowners. In my field of earthquake research, or my former field of earthquake research, you can get lots of big data to find out where the particularly vulnerable areas are to build a house. And so suddenly, when people start publishing block-by-block analysis of where the shaking was greatest in a recent earthquake, you're having a direct impact on people's housing value. And that's the largest investment most Americans have. So people get upset. Crime statistics is another place where you could have a direct impact on housing values. Well, I think it's good to get those crime statistics out there because it forces the police to take action. But if it turns out that some of these stories are based on faulty analysis or bad data or both, or bad methodology, or maybe the data is good but the headline is bad, then we cast a pall over the whole movement. So I think it's really important that as we do the investigative journalism, as we do this research, we be very clear on the methodology. We be transparent about how the data is collected. We make sure that we are as good as we can possibly be so that a few bad apples don't discredit the movement. It doesn't take too many cause celebs. A bad report, something that directly impacts a politician. Nothing leads to legislation in Washington faster than something that directly impacts a politician. A few of you in the audience are old enough to remember Judge Bork when he was up for nomination to the Supreme Court. Somebody managed to get a hold of his video rental records, made that publicly available. Every senator thought, oh my God, that could happen to me. Within a few weeks, there was a law providing much stronger protection for your video rental records than for your health records. So we have to be careful here. We have to be better than best in how we process the data, and particularly in how editors interpret the maps that are being produced, the trends that are being detected. Otherwise, you'll see reactions in the U.S., in Europe, and other countries locking down government data that we all need to do these kind of analysis, or in some cases just forbidding the kind of analysis that we need to do. So let's make the story a good one. Let's continue to show all the things that can be done, and let's make sure that we're transparent about what we're doing to the data and the limits of the conclusions we draw.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the conversation.